to Columbia University reunion, our exciting afternoon conversation with a Columbia alum of the School of General Studies, class of 2007, Christopher Riano. Christopher is graduated, as I mentioned, in 2007. He was a university senator. He's a recipient of the Owl Award. And today we are here to discuss with him. He is the author of the new book, and I'm going to hold it up because it's not yet out in the bookstores. It will be soon. Marriage Equality, From Outlaws to In-Laws. And what we're going to do for this hour is I'm going to give a brief introduction of Christopher. Then I've asked Christopher to give you a summary of the book. I can say I read a chapter while he was writing it, and also now I'm well into the book, but it's a great book, and I really look forward to this conversation. So let me start with giving you a quick introduction of Christopher. Christopher, it just started this week as the new executive director of the Center for Civic Education. This is the nation's largest and most prestigious constitutional law and civic education organization dedicated to promoting an enlightened and responsible citizenry committed to democratic principles and actively engaged in the practice of civic virtue both in America and around the globe. And what a time to be starting this new position. Previously, he served as Assistant Counsel to the Governor of New York, to Governor Cuomo for education, arts, and constitutional law. He also had previously served as the General Counsel for the New York State Liquor Authority, and also as an administrative law judge for New York State. And as a partner, he previously served at Drohan Lee, and he was the founder and CEO of the Riano Group. He teaches for us at Columbia. He is a world-renowned author, scholar, activist, and we just could not be more thrilled to have you, Christopher, to join us. Your book, Marriage Equality, From Outlaws to In-Laws, I can just share from what I've read. The book is extremely informative. I would say it is the definitive history of marriage equality and the movement in the United States. It offers stories of real people and going back decades to showing what early experiences were. I find the book, it will be a book that I feel will appeal to law schools, to undergraduates. It's a scholarly book. It's a book, though, that has great appeal for lay and people just wanting to understand the whole marriage equality movement. It's funny, smart, brilliant, intellectual. It has breadth and it has depth, and I highly recommend it. So Christopher, I'd like to turn it over to you to give a brief summary, and then I'd like to start with some questions. We'll have a couple of questions back and forth between Christopher and I, and then most of the time today we want to open it up for your questions and comments. Christopher.
Lisa, that was such a kind introduction. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you so much for the words about the book. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who's joining us today. It's so nice to see some of my former students, current students, alumni, faculty, staff, and it's just so exciting to have the opportunity to share this work and these years of work with everybody. You know, considering and looking at how this week and how, we are looking at a world full of multiple different instances of change at the moment, I can't think of anything more to introduce the book than a short passage that I found. It's from my favorite chapter. It's a chapter that really uses Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray as foils against each other. And I want to share this very short passage with everybody to help open the book and show how this does tell about the changes in family, the changes in religion, the changes in constitutional law over the last 50 years. Anna Pauli Murray came from a very different background. Born in 1910 and of Cherokee African and European ancestry, she fell between the cracks of the American dream. Pauli lost her mother at age 3, and a guard at a segregated mental institution in Alabama murdered her father. Aunt Pauline Fitzgerald Dame adopted her and raised her in the Durham, North Carolina home of Polly's maternal grandparents. She was a thin, wiry, ravenous child who devoured books and food in equal measure. And by the time she graduated from high school at 15, she was the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper, the president of the Literary Society, class secretary, a member of the debate club, a top student, and a forward on the basketball team. Refusing to attend a colored college in North Carolina, she learned about sexism when Columbia College told her it did not admit women. She ended up at Hunter College and lived in Harlem, where she befriended Langston Hughes and listened to Nat King Cole and soaked up the Harlem Renaissance. While Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a research fellow at Columbia Law School hoping for a tenure-track academic appointment, Pauli Murray was struggling with poverty and hunger, the oppression of racism, and a short stint in jail, and denigration for being a woman, though a very striking woman who could outthink the racists and the sexists. At a Richmond fundraiser for a death row inmate, she impressed Thurgood Marshall and Howard Ransom, who got her admitted to Howard University Law School. Older than most students and smarter than most faculty, she figured out at Howard that Jane Crow, a term she invented, was just as an oppressive system as Jim Crow, and she graduated first in her class. Pauli maintained that America would never be a legitimate democracy so long as African Americans were disenfranchised and excluded from public institutions and private opportunities. To pursue her idea, she applied to do graduate work at the Harvard Law School, which rejected her because of her sex. Pauli responded with a witty petition for reconsideration. "Gentlemen, I would gladly change my sex to meet your requirements, but since the way to such change has not been revealed to me, I have no recourse but to appeal to you to change your minds on this subject. Are you to tell me that one is as difficult as the other?" Pauli was only half joking. She didn't identify as a woman, and she might indeed have corrected her sex if it had been feasible for her. She described herself as a male head and brain, femalish body, mixed emotional characteristics. In her words, she was just one of nature's experiments, a girl who should have been a boy. And just as Ruth was naturally left-handed, feminine, and attracted to funny boys, Pauli was naturally aggressive, outspoken, and attracted to nice white girls. She did not see herself as a lesbian, for she regarded herself as very naturally falling in love with the female sex, as being consistent with her identity as a man. Today, she would probably be self-identify as transgender, non-binary, or queer. I use this passage, this very short passage from probably my favorite chapter in the book, to open because I think it shows the intersectionality that we've woven into this story. A story of over 50 years that describes how the marriage equality movement is also a movement that shows changes in, like I said, family, religion, constitutional law, but also changes in the way that society addresses diversity. I think that's one of the things that I'm so excited about that the book shows, that I think really helps me to give an overview in many ways of what stories the book really tells.
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you for sharing that passage. And at this time, you're so right that we need inspiration. We very much, in this very dark time, we need a motivation for change and action. So I'd like to start with personal for you. What inspired you to write this amazing book? And I guess while you were writing it, and I know this was certainly a labor of love, I know since I've been Dean, right when I started, you were already, I feel like working maybe for years on it already. I mean, what surprised you about the experience of writing it? If you could just talk personally.
You know, Dean, thank you. As you know, Dean, the book is quite substantial, and the book really does anchor itself as the definitive history of marriage equality. I would say my inspiration actually probably in many ways comes from much of my time as a constitutional scholar, but also somebody who thinks about the Constitution as a document that really just sets the stage for how we all relate to one another. The Constitution is really this incredible document that really does encapsulate so many of the pieces of American history that I think tells a tale of a nation that has, and many times, embraced what we see today and embraced the way in which we engage with government in a different way than many other societies. So I think one of the things that really inspired me to put this work together was seeing how the marriage equality movement, at least as it's been told in many of the current works out there, it seems very singular. You have one story about one particular individual who works their way through and gets this magical court case or something at the Supreme Court, this moment of legal change. And in so many ways, the way I look at this from a larger perspective is marriage equality, it really is the story of families that have changed. It's really religion that has changed. And in many ways, it inspires me to see that change is always possible, that we are a culture that embraces change. And that in many ways seems maybe counter to what we think of constitutional law, this stoic concept. But I think it's actually very parallel. And I think it's one of the brilliant parts about having the opportunity to work on something like this, where you can be inspired by one piece of this, maybe a family law scholar, maybe people who have approached marriage equality from the opposite side. And I think one of the things that I've been very proud of with the work is it's people who were pro-marriage equality and people who were anti-marriage equality who we were able to interview, work with, and try to tell the actual accurate tale of how this worked. Obviously celebrating the result, but also showing the humanity and the humanism that's behind folks that fought against marriage equality for many of the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I have to say, 2 years ago when you were working on it, and I remember having the opportunity to read the chapter on AIDS, and I remember just how nuanced it was, and so much of that came. And I do say that I think this book will be for so many, again, certainly students of law and students studying constitutional law, but I think for undergraduates, all the different dimensions. And I can just say on a personal note, I'm working with one of our GS students, Peter Trevino, and I are developing a new course on AIDS in society, and we definitely hope to use the book there. So speaking about your journey in writing it, what do you hope for this book? And again, going back to the passage you shared and thinking about the times we're in right now, what would you like to see? I mean, if we fast forward now in 5 years, and people would be, how might this book contribute to changing the narrative, contribute to better understanding? If you could speak a little bit to that.
That's such a good question, Lisa. Thank you. I think in so many ways, I would hope that the book inspires people to unite. I feel very strongly that as much as we can have a dialogue and debate about free speech or about relations in society or about change, there's really no question in my mind that we are stronger together when we are united. And one of the things that I think will surprise people is to see how incredibly unifying something like this can be. Because what it does is it creates so much change in the system over time that all of these ripple effects that come afterwards really have an impact on so many other parts of different institutions. Just for an example, we now live in a society, because of marriage equality, where there's a menu of relationship options. And one of the things that makes me very happy to have that ability to show is it's because marriage equality pushed forward domestic partnerships, and because marriage equality pushed forward civil unions, and it pushed forward domestic unions in ways that are registered with cities and with states. There's now all of these very interesting legal relationships that are possible for both same-sex and opposite-sex couples. And I think one of the things that I hope, looking back, as we look at, if this is the month, Obergefell v. Hodges came out in June of 2015. It's been literally 5 years since marriage equality was the law of the land. So I hope that when we look back and we see the challenges that exist 5 years from then, today, that this work is a work that shows the power of that unity, the power of that indivisibility, the power that really does exist in the opportunity of free speech and freedom to assemble and the freedom to petition, and what happens when people come together and cross barriers that may exist in order to further change. If there's anything that can come from the marriage equality movement story and the 50 years that we tell, it's that it's differences that really unite us as opposed to divide us. And so I'm very hopeful that this book serves to inspire 5 years and 10 years and 20 years from now, because there really is nothing like the marriage equality and LGBTQ rights movement in the last 50 years. It's a very unique thing to have a chance to study and to talk about.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think the way you did this and really achieved your goal was through the voices, through the stories of the individuals. I mean, right from the beginning, it is a book, and I have to say, if it wasn't 1,000 pages, double-sided, I feel I would. It's a book that's really hard to put down, because you, in a very intelligent way, tell the story of the constitutional law and all the different rulings, and of course this is a state by state story until we had some of the advances, and I can think about just Jack Baker and Michael McConnell. I feel I know them. I feel they almost you do it in a way with humor and a way of telling their family lives and a lot of details that just provide that social context. And while doing that, I feel you got religion and history and the social issues and the political issues. But what was the process of weaving together the 50 years of different experiences all around this same topic? I mean, how many interviews were you do? How did you pull this off?
It has been a labor of love. I think in so many ways, this has been many, many, many years of work.
Right.
It is hundreds and hundreds of interviews. I am very proud to say that after spending so much time with my co-author, that we not only still speak, but we get along probably better now than we ever have. I have come to really have a deep relationship with my co-author, which I think is such a wonderful thing. And I think the process is one where you take in the information, and there are thousands and thousands of pages of notes and interviews, but there are moments of humanity that really come out, and those moments of humanity really stick out, especially in my mind, as a point where you have the responsibility to tell these tales. I can, as an example, as you know, Dean, one of the focus families that we focus on throughout the entire book are April and Jane.
Right, and you go back to their parents even, yeah. which I loved, saying what the parents were thinking in the 1970s, thinking about Jack and Michael's story. So
well, and that's I just got goosebumps, because that's what makes this such a labor of true dedication and love. Because you can take April and Jane, these nurses in Michigan, who adopt all of these foster children and don't even want to be married, and yet are almost forced to get and be the face of marriage equality. And I can remember sitting in the judge's chambers and interviewing him and having lunch with his clerks and talking to him about how he, as a Republican judge, faced marriage equality in Michigan and ruled in their favor. And I can remember sitting in their house after seeing him and playing with their kids and really coming to understand over dinner how they became this incredible force in the movement. It's those tales and those moments where you actually are sitting there as an author and you just realize this incredible weight of responsibility. This incredible desire to make sure that you take the time to try to get this right. And I'm hoping that the book does stand that test of time, because I think it does tell so many of these different tales, like you said, about Jack, and you can go into the third chapter and look at the AIDS story, and you can look at the way in which Land Illegal and other organizations grappled with this incredible shift and social shift, political shift, health shift. I mean, changes that were drastic to the community. that impact the community and many communities now. And trying to weave all those tales together over 50 years was part of both the fun, but definitely part of the challenge as well.
Yeah, and I was so struck by the ingenuity. Like, I never realized using the strategy of adopting one another. That was something that was really, it was a note, and for others, the strategy was that there was these two 30-year-old men, and to be able to be there by bedside to make medical decisions or control one's estates, that it was so much to learn in this book. So, of course, as the Dean of General Studies, and at Columbia, I certainly want to ask you, and it was obvious to me, but if you can speak to how your education, both your education in law school, but we'd love to hear about your liberal arts education, how that influenced your interest in writing this book and where you pulled on some of your classes at Columbia.
Yeah, thank you. There's no question in my mind, this work would not have been possible were it not for my Columbia experience. And I can explain in so many ways, it was the experience that I had as an undergraduate in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom, that taught me the skills necessary to make it possible to really engage and interact with so many diverse individuals over the years. As you can imagine, interviewing so many people over so many years is an incredible, passionate experience, because the people you get to interview, the hundreds and hundreds of people, really we're not just there, but they have a real dedication to what happens and what happened to them. And especially when you speak to folks that were passionate on the opposite side of the issue, they have in so many ways never been able to tell their stories and never been able to explain their background and why they feel the way that they did. Those are some of the voices that I wanted to capture very specifically. Those dedicated interviews that I most certainly would say I learned about over time from my Columbia experience. In so many ways, both as a university senator and my work in general studies more broadly, it really did show me how to engage with people on multiple different sides of an issue, how to make sure that I was both getting their story correct, how to make sure that I was getting the story that I wanted to actually be able to retell. And then obviously, as we all know on the video today, then being able to tell it and then making sure that I could write it and write it in a way that is understandable and relatable, and write it so even as an attorney, I'm communicating law and religion and family to people who may not know much about law, religion, and family. And that's a good thing. That's something that I celebrate, because then I have a chance to show through the lens of marriage equality that change is possible, and that there's a positive future ahead of us, which I think sometimes can get lost in the mix. And that's something, all of those things are things that I picked up during my time as an undergraduate at the School of General Studies.
Thank you. And this goes without saying that how proud Dean On would have been of you and been able to read this book. And I'm sure he was in your heart as you were finishing this up. So let me just ask you one more question, and then we're going to go on. We're going to open it up, and my dear colleague, Jill Gallus-Hickey, is going to man the questions. But the book takes us through the Supreme Court victory for marriage equality in 2015 that you referred to, and up to 2017. And then that's when I know when I first read it in early 2018. What legal issues do you see on the horizon for LGBTQ civil rights? And I think we all say this with trepidation, watching how the courts are going with all the new judges in the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. It's amazing. I have to say, my students who are on, or former students who are on right now, will absolutely recognize what I'm about to say. But I would argue in so many ways that the path towards justice, the path towards equality, the path towards liberty is a path that frequently swings like a pendulum. And when you see 5 years ago marriage equality advance and become the law of the land, you almost immediately see the pendulum start swinging the other way. So 5 years later, there are some incredible advances in the LGBTQ rights space. You see a new found invigoration and a newfound optic to transgender rights and non-binary individuals in the community. And I think that's extraordinary. And yet at the same time, we've seen things like the bathroom bills in North Carolina and other places, and questions about whether or not same-sex parents and couples should be able to adopt, which I know the Solicitor General just filed a brief this week against allowing same-sex couples to adopt children. So this pendulum is constantly moving. And as soon as you seem to make a progress in one place, you often see a change in that progress in another place. As soon as you see Hawaii rule for marriage equality, you actually see the exact thing come right back away, and they take it back. And that leaves it for many, many years before you see Goodridge and marriage equality in Massachusetts in 2003. So in so many ways, I understand the trepidation when it comes to the courts and when it comes to the law at the moment, even at the Supreme Court level. I think marriage equality is likely perfectly fine. But there are so many pieces to marriage, so many pieces to a relationship that may not necessarily be advancing in the same way. Like I said, same-sex adoption rights. And that is something that I hope the book speaks to, because the book is very hopeful. The book is very positive. The book and the work definitely attempt to show that there's a brighter future ahead, even when you look at the way that the courts may look. So I actually, in some ways, turn to the story of New York. And in New York, the New York State Court of Appeals said in a decision in Hernandez that marriage equality would not be decided by the courts in New York. And what it did is it galvanized, for the first time in American history, people in New York to pass marriage equality through the legislature. And that story is an incredible story, because it shows the unified front at when the governor that we currently have was first elected, between him and his ability to use the political process to twist arms and change opinions and change votes. And you have this incredible tale of failure in the legislature 1 year, and then 2 years later, success, where literally tell vote by vote that marriage equality will become the law of the state of New York, and it is signed at 11:57 p.m. And at night that same day. And you have this extraordinary accomplishment after that defeat. So I hope, if anything, coming back in the bigger picture to looking at the courts, I hope that people and others don't feel disengaged from the process. We have 3 branches of government, and we also have multiple layers between the local government, the state government, and the federal government. The structure of constitutionalism in America is incredible. It is truly extraordinary. So even if we look at a change in the federal courts, you can look at ways the state courts address things, like the book does. You can look at the ways in which executives address things, which we do. And you can look at the way in which the legislature, the way in which legislatures across the country address marriage equality. And I think seeing this particular social movement, you can see hope in all of those. You can see ways in which change is advanced in all of those. And so I know, because I hear it all the time, that people are nervous about the courts. But the courts are a piece of the puzzle. The puzzle is much broader, and the puzzle is much stronger. And so I hope that people realize, and everybody realizes, that even if there's a change in one spot, there are so many other ways to engage with government that exist that truly make this American experiment something that's never been seen before or since.
Okay, wow, thank you. That is very, very, very inspiring. I would like to turn it over to Jill. Before I do, though, I just want to bring everybody's attention to the chat room. Estrella Castillo, our GS class of 2019, has put a link where you can order Christopher's book from Yale University Press. Estrella herself is going to be at Yale in the fall, and which we congratulate her for. So please think about ordering this amazing book if you are interested. So Jill, I know you already have some questions that people submitted beforehand, and then please, we encourage you to write questions or comments in the chat line, but I'm gonna turn this over to Jill Gallis-Hickey, who is our Dean of Development and Alumni Affairs at Columbia GS. Jill?
Thank you, Dean Rosen-Metsch, and thank you, Christopher. This has been wonderful, and I'm so impressed with the group. We have some questions that a lot of people have sent in during their registration. So I'm going to go to those first, but just in case you're unsure of how to use the system, if you put your cursor at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat icon and you can type your question in there and we'll get to them in a little while. Thank you. So Estrella Castillo, we're going to start with your question since you were so kind to send one in when you registered. This is the question. I would appreciate hearing a little more about Christopher Riano's thoughts regarding the future of marriage as an institution within the context of non-traditional relationships, examples, ethical non-monogamy, co-parenting trends, polyamory, accommodating trans and multigender attractions. Christopher?
Thank you, Jill. And Estrella, thank you. I hope that question was inspired a little bit by class last year. I think in so many ways that, and it's such a good question too, I think in so many ways, what makes me proudest of the work, and I think the reason that I opened by reading about polyamory is that the work really does try to look at the LGBTQ movement very broadly. In fact, one of the things that I know we did in the work is as you read and as history goes forward, we actually go from LGB to LGBT to LGBTQ, because that's how the movement has changed over time too. I think one of the things that's really incredible about that piece that I read earlier is it comes from a chapter called The Families We Choose. And Families We Choose is something that my co-author and I really argue so strongly for, because it's an incredible thing to think about how marriage itself, and shockingly I would argue marriage equality itself, is actually a very conservative concept. It's a very conservative concept that was advanced in a very liberal way, shockingly enough. And that's part of what makes it, I think, a fascinating study of history for. But one of the things that I think marriage equality has pushed forward is this idea of these different menu of relationship options and these different opportunities that may exist for people to construct their own relationships. If there's anything that I think both my co-author and I would argue for, it's that there's an inherent liberty that exists within the marriage equality movement that really advances the individualism that I think is critical to think through when it comes to where marriage equality has taken us. I can give you an example. One of my favorite passages, or a short little sentence from the book, actually says, at the heart of liberty is the authority of each human being, not just the privileged few, to figure out his, her, or their own life and career path without discrimination or discriminatory government commandeering. Charles Sumner, who helped write the Equal Protection Clause, uses a metaphor from state constitutional provisions that inspired the federal provision for equality. And he said that every human being is one of the children of the state, which, like an impartial parent, regards all of its offspring with an equal care. And so I think in so many ways, the movement for LGBTQ rights has actually advanced so many other pieces of the LGBTQ community. And I would argue that and the book ends on the families we choose, I think specifically because we celebrate how this has helped bring forward individuals and given strength to individuals who are part of the transgender community and part of the non-binary community and part of the polyamorous community, who are looking at ways to ensure that the state protects their desired relationship. And I think that's actually a very powerful thing. It's something that I would argue is actually inherently baked into constitutional theory.
Thank you, Christopher. Next question is from Ernest Mentees, who's also on with us today. Given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, do you believe that marriage equality is sustainable in the United States?
And so I tie back a little bit to what I said earlier, but I'll also say this, because I think this is something that often is sometimes missed when we look at the Supreme Court of the United States. The vast majority of Supreme Court decisions are actually unanimous or nearly unanimous. The court does not break down the way that we sometimes think it does. And if you look at marriage equality as an example, I can use this as an example because we tell about it in the book. We tell the story in the book of the justices and their discussions about the way in which this case should come out. And we were able to get an insider view of the court through our interviews. And you can look at marriage equality, and you would think that the court would have really attached to the Equal Protection Clause and really looked at that. But they didn't. They looked at marriage equality through the lens of liberty. And it's only really one justice that celebrates the Equal Protection Clause the way that it may have been intended. And so I say all of that to circle back around to the fact that the court doesn't vote the way we think they do. And if you look at statistics on the way that the court often votes, it's a justice's individual history. It's a justice's individual experience that is far more informative as to how they might look at a case than the partisan divide that often permeates the discussions about the Supreme Court. So I say that as a positive, because I think what that shows us is that it's very difficult to actually determine those tea leaves and see how the court may or may not vote on an issue. I can use an example that's currently before the court. At this moment, marriage equality is the law of the land. You have to be allowed to marry a spouse, a same-sex spouse in every state, and they must accord you those rights. But in most states, you can be fired for that marriage. In most states, that's the only thing that they need to hear to legitimately discriminate against LGBTQ individuals and families. That case and those cases are at the Supreme Court right now. And fortunately, through some of interviews that have continued and just common discussions that existed within the community, that case is the oldest case on the docket yet to be decided. And the reason in many ways that is because of the way in which judicial politics operates and the kind of backroom dealings that are happening right now. But I think that's actually, in some ways, often positive. The justices take their decisions very seriously. The justices do not look at things through a partisan lens, and I can say that for all of them. They actually look at things through the lens that they bring into their seat on the court. So it actually gives me a lot of hope when it comes to the way that these cases look. It gives me a lot of hope when it comes to marriage equality from a legal standpoint and a court-based standpoint. But I say that with the caveat from before that we have to remain vigilant. We have to think about how we're constantly advancing not only the interests of one particular set of Americans, but all Americans. And I think we have to see that those intersections and those commonalities in order to be a more perfect and stronger union. So the court's a piece of that, and I'm always interested in that piece. But I think in so many ways, I worry less about one particular institution in government, and I'm always thinking about how government as a whole is operating when it comes to any particular issue that may be in discussion at the moment.
Great, Christopher, I think your answer starts to dovetail into a question from Peter Trevino. So you may want to elaborate a little bit on your answer that you just gave with this question. Where do we go from here? Besides a version of ENDA, what do you think is the next in line of necessary national change for the LGBTQ plus community?
You know, in so many ways, ENDA is obviously a piece of the puzzle because it would allow this question of protection when it comes to your employment to be federal law. And that would change that in federal statute to definitely include sexual orientation and within the protections that are afforded that at the moment are being argued under the concept of sex at the court. But I think that's just a piece of the puzzle, because employment, while obviously critical, is not a whole person. Person obviously is themselves at home, it's their families, it's themselves when it comes to their institutions, their civil institutions, their civic institutions. And whether it's employment or it is adoption or it is ensuring that not just these seemingly fundamental pieces are protected, but I'll go back to the dean's actual expertise and point that we talked about earlier. You can see the amazing impact that the AIDS epidemic had on the LGBTQ community, but in so many ways after that, it had an impact on society and has an impact on society. So I would think that to the question, Peter, in so many ways, we're all in this together. And we often use very divisive language. And one of the things that this comes to mind, when I was interviewing a faith leader, after the interview, they pulled me aside and they said, you know, I really have no problem with marriage equality. I just have to argue for it because it's how I raise my money. And I thought that was shocking because it told me that oftentimes it's the systems that put people in places and push people in certain ways that forces a different outcome than one might expect. And it's that divisiveness that creates, I think, larger problems for the LGBTQ community, but I think for the community at large and the society at large in a far greater way. So I think in reason that I like that particular background, and there's a lot of background on religion in the book, and I think one thing that makes me very, very, very proud is not just how we're able to tell the story about how religion has changed because of marriage equality, but we have people similar to some of the highest levels of the Latter-day Saints Church who've said this is the fairest book on the topic. This is the book that tells the story of religion and change as well. We're all in this together. We are all in this American experiment together. We are all in this constitutional experiment together. And so it is the right of a transgendered person to express themselves under the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. That is the same as the right of a non-binary person to express themselves. It's the same as the right of a lesbian couple to get married and have children. It's the same as an opposite sex couple's right to do exactly those same things. It is back to that quote on liberty that I would say becomes so important. And it's back to that concept that I think we have to really embrace and push forward. It is an incredible opportunity that we're always handed at a time of crisis to find ways to unify and come together. And as a society that's currently facing multiple crises, these are the points and the inflection points of change. And so I say all of that to come back to, I think, a theme that people have heard me say time and time again. I often am asked by students, you know, do I look at current events and get nervous? Or do I look at the court and get nervous? Or do I look at who was just elected and get nervous? And I really don't. I look at it as an opportunity because it shows me that there are going to be people that will mobilize in different ways. There are going to be people that find ways to make change happen. But more importantly, so many of these instances and things are unifiers. So many things in crises that seem to divide actually bring together. And so I do try to stay positive and stay hopeful and stay involved. The thing that I would come and close on with this question is, the most important thing that people can do is to be involved. It is critical to our civic society to be a virtuous, involved citizen. And I never prescribe how to be involved. I don't think that that's not my role, but I will argue and celebrate to be involved, to get involved, however that looks, whatever that means to you. That's critical to this fabric of our democracy. I think you can see throughout the work, we tell so many stories of people who didn't want to be involved and then got involved and made palpable change. So I think, Peter, that was a very long answer to a very short and great question. But in so many ways, I don't know how else to answer something when you look at the future and we embrace the future without really thinking about how critical it is to stay a piece of the institutions that mean something to us. And that includes staying a part of the alumni community and the student community and the greater community we have at Columbia and at GS.
Thank you, Christopher. Now, would you take a second and possibly share one of your favorite stories from the book?
Sure, absolutely. In so many ways, I can think of a number of different stories that come to mind. But the one that I think was the most striking, and the one that we've talked about a little bit that we weave throughout the book, is the story of April and Jane. And the reason I want to come back to that, even though there are so many other pieces to the puzzle, is there's something so uniquely inspiring to see two individuals who had nothing to do with the marriage equality movement be thrust into the middle of it, and to be so deeply dedicated to wanting to protect their children. And that's how this all began, as them going to a lawyer to try to protect and make sure that their children would be okay if something happened to them, to where they're now in a federal court. Their lawyer has mortgaged her house to pay for this case. Their other lawyer is this scrappy attorney in Michigan, who now is the Michigan Attorney General, the first woman lesbian Attorney General for the state of Michigan today. And they are fighting the former Michigan Attorney General, and they don't want to get married. They don't want to have anything to do with this, and they have to. And they took up that mantle of change, and they took up that mantle of the imperative, and took this case all the way to the Supreme Court. And throughout that tale that we tell in each chapter, and weave in each chapter to tell the story of their families, and the story of when we visited their church, and the story of how their church has changed, and the story of how their mother's views changed, and the story of how their children, a multiracial family of all foster children who were adopted because these nurses saw people in need in their hospitals. In their hospitals, they saw children in need, so they adopted them. Not one, not two, not three, not four, not even five. In fact, at some points, they've had 6 foster children and a mix of adopted children. And they take this case to the Supreme Court because they feel they don't have a choice. They have to protect their family. It's an incredibly inspiring thing to see just 2 people in Hazel Park, Michigan, who can have that type of impact and change a Republican judge's and a pretty conservative, I shouldn't say Republican, a conservative judge's view of marriage, and change it so profoundly that he is their biggest supporter and advocate. Now, I mean, Judge Friedman, we call him Bernie. Bernie had us all over the courthouse for a day because he was so proud to have been a part of this. And to see the way in which people engaged and the way in which that kept going throughout so many years, that story in so many ways is so incredibly inspiring to see people that do take up that mantle. And so that's one of quite literally probably dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of stories, but it's one that resonates very deeply with me. And I think that's, and with my co-author, I think that's why, as we went through the interviews, we realized that was the tale we wanted to weave consistently and constantly. It's because there really is nothing like, and there really are very few people like April and Jane.
Thank you. Before I turn this back over to you, Christopher and Dean Rosen-Metsch, for final remarks, I just want to encourage everyone that participated. We will share all of the questions with Christopher, and we can get some information to all of you about his book outside of the chat. So in case there's something you wanted more detail on, he'll be happy to support that answer and get some information to you. So now to the Dean and Christopher for final remarks, please.
You know, Joe, I see there's one more question in the chat. Maybe we have time for 2 more minutes. That Stephen can answer?
Stephen, I see the question.
Okay.
Yes. So Stephen, that's a great question. I'll read it just so that everybody can see it. You know, is there a potential the Supreme Court may uphold the right to same-sex marriage but deny equal employment opportunities? Absolutely. There's no question. You could absolutely see the Supreme Court rule against the Title VII cases because in so many ways, it's an interesting way in which the Title VII cases have been argued. And it's interesting to see the background of the way that these cases look. But I have to say, there's no question they could rule in that direction. And yes, you would have what we have today, which is the opportunity to be in a same-sex marriage and yet put a picture of your husband or wife up and be fired that day and have that be perfectly legal. And again, that's in most states, not a minority, in a majority of states. There's really no question that in some ways that's possible. And what I think that would do is it would just, again, galvanize people to find ways to change the law, possibly pass ENDA, possibly enshrine in federal statute that this isn't okay anymore. These things take time. Civil rights takes time. The march towards a unified equality takes time. And it took many, many years to get to marriage equality itself. I think that's part of what makes this area so fascinating. But at the same time, it's one of the reasons why I argue so strongly that we have to remain deeply engaged.
Great. And Christopher, there's 2 other questions that came on, and it's 2:54. So I think we have maybe a couple more minutes to go with them. So I think one question is, based on your research, this is from Ken Barnes, what is the messaging we should use to change the hearts and minds of persons who don't support marriage equality? And maybe you could just spend a minute or 2 tying this back to the sexual revolution, to patriarchy, you know, and some of the things you learned from the book about where there was a lot of people not happy with marriage equality, and that still exists today.
Absolutely. I think one thing, and we actually have almost an entire chapter on this, one thing that I actually was shocked by during our research, equality sounds wonderful. Equality makes people feel good. There's something about using the word equality that levels the playing field and really seems to bring people together. But equality and the word equality and the arguments for equality did not move marriage equality forward. And when we looked at the research and the messaging, and we looked and interviewed those who did the research and the messaging, we found quite strongly that when you saw ads or you saw messages that said, I support equality between same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples, it never moved the needle. It never changed the dial. It wasn't a winning message. What we found and what strategists found and others found during the research and everything was it was actually the golden rule that changed the message. So saying we should be equal didn't work, but saying you should treat people the way you want to be treated, that did work. That did change the way people approached marriage equality. That did change the way in which people approached marriage. And between that and the other thing that we found, that which is so powerful, which is the fact that as lesbian and gay couples came out of the closet, and as lesbian and gay couples became viewable and knowable to people, as soon as Jim and Mary in Minnesota have a gay or lesbian daughter or son, or a gay and lesbian couple as a neighbor, that changes everything too. Because then when you say to them, you should be treating people the way you want to be treated, it makes sense in their head. Yes, of course, I think that they should be treated how I want to be treated. That changes the needle. That changes the dial. And as you said, Dean, in so many ways, you actually see similar things happen in feminism, and you see similar things happen in racial equality, and you see similar things happen in all of the other pieces that we tell over the story. It is finding ways to connect that pushes forward the idea that people should be treated equally. Finding ways to show people that it is about you. It's about everybody. That makes a difference. And so I think that's why, Dean, we spend so much time talking about how the feminist movement made a humongous difference to marriage equality, how civil rights has made a humongous difference to marriage equality, how other pieces have made such a humongous difference to marriage equality, because coming all the way back, it is that unifying perspective. It is that unification and finding ways to move things forward together. That's what changes hearts and minds. That's what makes a difference. And I think, Ken, it's such a good question, Ken. I think when it comes to the way in which people currently look at things, it's just the fact that they begin to know people, and they begin to see people, and they begin to communicate with people, that takes the fear level down, so they're not so afraid of what a gay couple may look like, or a lesbian couple may look like. That changes the way that things look.
Right. Wow. There is a couple more questions that hopefully you can grab in the chat. One from Sheridan Gayer and one from Paul Spessa. So, but hopefully you can get back to them directly. I can't thank you enough. There's so much excitement. Again, I'm holding up the book here for Yale University Press. Estrella put a link to it. We will look to continue to celebrate with you as you start your book tour. I certainly think when we're back, hopefully in person, we'll try to host another event at GS, maybe in the new Peter J. on Lounge when we have it ready. And Christopher, congratulations on your book. On your new job, and we're counting on you, and we're there with you to try to enact change. So thank you, and thank you to everybody for joining us for Columbia School of General Studies. This is our last reunion event. Thanks again to our whole team at GS for putting everything together, and we wish you all safety, health, and good wishes. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christopher, so much. Thank you, Dean Rosen-Metsch. Bye, everybody.